After a mass shooting takes place, there's a lot of groups and group dynamics at play, but I'd like to focus on two groups in particular. I always hesitate to put people in these boxes, and I realize that you don't all fit so neatly into them. There is a general tendency, however, that is prevalent enough to illustrate my points in this video. I'll call the two groups A and B. Group A has a collectivist tendency and usually makes accusations. Group B has an individualist tendency and often feels accused by Group A and makes defenses which sometimes include counter-accusations. Arguments both good and bad have been made by each group. Group A will say things like, it's the fault of that group, it's the fault of that ideology, it's the fault of that situation you helped cause, we want to mitigate oppression and help victims, you're an enabler or apologist or somehow complicit. And Group B will say, not all, be nuanced, be more nuanced, where the killer, they got the ideology wrong, or they'll say that the killer acted alone, but we don't do that. Personal accountability, you're using this event to push an agenda. You drove them to do it. Now, again, both groups can have valid points. For examples on how these arguments play out, we're going to look at three recent mass shootings, each occurring 1 year apart. One born of sexism, one born of racism, and then one born of homophobia. The final shooting, the one born of homophobia, presented a very interesting shift in the dynamics of these two groups, which is why I'm making this video. On May 23rd, 2014, Elliot Rodger went on a killing spree. Beforehand, he gave his reasons for doing it, which stemmed from his frustrations with women, not being able to get female affection, etc. Shortly thereafter, of course, we have the typical killing spree blame game. Group A blamed toxic masculinity, pickup artist culture, patriarchy, misogyny, MRAs, MGTOWs, and even men in general. Group B argued against Group A by stating not all men, that most men, even misogynistic ones, don't go on killing sprees, and it's unfair to implicate them in this guy's murders. The guy acted on his own. Some even argued that, quote-unquote, feminazis drove him to do it with their extremism and with the way they've influenced our culture to be anti-male. Group A is accused of taking advantage of this tragedy to vilify people who had nothing to do with it, and accused of pushing an agenda. 1 year later, on June 17th, 2015, Dylann Roof went on a killing spree. Beforehand, he gave his reasons for doing it, which stemmed from his hatred of black people. Shortly thereafter, of course, you have the typical killing spree blame game. This time, Group A blamed systemic racism, white supremacy, white privilege, and even white people in general, the usual Group A positions that tend toward collectivism. Group B argued against Group A by stating not all white people, that most white people, even racist ones, don't go on killing sprees, and it's unfair to implicate them in this guy's murders. The guy acted on his own. Some even argued that black supremacists and SJWs drove him to do it with their extremism and anti-white influence on our culture. Group A is accused of taking advantage of this tragedy to vilify people who had nothing to do with it, and accused of pushing an agenda. 1 year later, on June 12th, 2016, Omar Mateen went on a killing spree. Beforehand, he gave his reasons for doing it, which stemmed from his Islamic religious beliefs. Shortly thereafter, of course, you have the typical killing spree blame game. This time, however, since Omar was part of a group that has a marginalized status in the West, a Muslim, a very interesting flip takes place. Groups A and B switch sides. Group A uses Group B's former arguments, and Group B uses Group A's former arguments. Group A adopts arguments they once perceived as awful and uncompelling, while Group B applies Group A's former arguments where they actually ought to be applied, because they're arguments against systemic oppression. I say they ought to be applied in this case because the systemic oppression of gay people is actually codified in Islamic holy text and carried out in mass. Group A has no problem telling men to reject misogyny, toxic masculinity, and male privilege. Group A collectivizes the blame by appealing to the systemic nature of sexism and saying that our laws and cultures in Western civilization, while not explicitly condoning treating the sexes differently, do end up affecting the sexes in different ways. Group A will tell white people to reject white supremacy and white privilege. Group A collectivizes the blame by appealing to the systemic nature of racism and saying that our laws and culture of Western civilization, while not explicitly condoning treating the races differently, do end up affecting the races in different ways. But then, when it comes to Islam, Group A will adamantly refuse to collectivize the blame, despite the fact that the systemic nature of homophobia is actually explicitly condoned, codified, and encouraged within Islamic laws and cultures, including systematic sexism and racism, like female genital mutilation and modern-day slavery. Despite this, Group A will never tell Muslims to reject Islam. This is due to cultural context and isolation. Since Muslims are a minority in the West, Group A naturally wants to protect them from oppression. Most Muslims, however, do not live in the West, so the horrendous human rights violations largely found amongst a populace of 1.6 billion people are deliberately overlooked for the benefit of the few million who live in the West and who cannot enact the oppressive aspects of their doctrine because they're a minority here and because our Western secular laws prevent them from doing so, or because they've assimilated into our culture, or because they were born and raised here and accept our culture as their own. Yes, I've heard your arguments and I understand. No, it's not all Muslims. I understand. Individuals are responsible for their actions. Yes, Western policies have had an influence on racism, sexism, and terrorism. No, I do not want Muslims to be treated unfairly. You're using the arguments Group B used to use against you, and I agree with them. Now that we've established that I've heard you and agree, I want you to hear your own arguments that you've previously made against systemic oppression and apply those arguments consistently to Islam. Yes, there is a problem with Islamic ideology and Islamic culture. Yes, Islamism has promoted systemic racism, systemic sexism, homophobia, and terrorism. No, you should not be an apologist for any of that. Now, if those arguments are good enough to criticize ourselves and our own culture, then they should be good enough to criticize others. Stop selectively applying your virtue and start being consistent. Logic applies to everybody. Yes, I understand that you're concerned about the maltreatment of the 3 million Muslims who live in the United States, roughly 1% of our population. The protection of that minority, however, does not need to entail the enabling and the apologetics that provide cover for the atrocities that occur within the cultures of the other 1.6 billion Muslims, 31% of the entire world, who don't happen to live in the United States. Stop being so myopic. Self-deprecation does not save you from the fact that you support sexism, racism, homophobia, and terrorism when you support Islam.